Okay, welcome to Talking Data Equity for Friday, August 5th, 25th, last Friday in August. And you have arrived at Talking Data Equity. My name is Heather Kraus, and I'm coming to you today from Toronto, Canada. And I am coming to you as part of an organization called We All Count. We All Count is a project for equity in all things data. And one of the things that We All Count does is we host Talking Data Equity most Fridays. We don't host it every single Friday. In fact, we don't host it next Friday, but most Fridays we have an informal kind of hangout on Zoom. And we get together and invite anybody who's interested in the topic of data equity or working on the practice of data equity or thinking about data equity, any country, any sector, any level of expertise to get together and share ideas, share resources, and ask questions in an informal environment. And sometimes we have topics like technical topics, how to weight data, how to design a survey question. Sometimes we have ask me anything kind of things, and sometimes we have special guests. And today is one of the special guest days. And so I'm going to introduce you to our special guest in just a minute. But let me do a tiny bit of housekeeping, which is that this is a drop-in event open to anybody who signs up to get the Zoom link. So we have a lot of people. And in order to kind of maintain the ability to have a conversation in the space, we ask that while our special guest is sharing their stories, sharing their examples, that you stay on mute during that part. And feel free to use the chat as much as you would like to ask questions, to have conversations with other people who are here in this meeting, to share resources. And when you use the Zoom chat, you can use that drop-down menu set to everyone, in which case your question or your comment or your resource will be visible to everybody. Or if you feel more comfortable asking a question privately, you can direct message me and I'll amplify your question without associating it with your name. So that's how to use the Zoom chat. And then once our special guest is done with the kind of informal presentation part of today, that's when we're going to open it up for live Q&A. So that's when, if you want to come off mute, we ask you to raise your hand in a couple of different Zoom styles, and then we'll bring you off mute and we'll just have a conversation in a live Q&A. So that's the housekeeping. We're extremely happy that you are here. Lots of familiar regulars and a bunch of new people because of the very exciting topic for today. So the topic for today is being brought to us by special guest, Dr. Brianna Blaser. And Brianna has her PhD from the University of Washington, and her work is wide ranging. She's going to talk to us today about data on disability. Why is it so hard to collect it? Why is it so hard to understand it? And Dr. Blaser is working at the Do It Center at the University of Washington. And in her work, Brianna increases the participation of people with disabilities in science and engineering careers. She is the associate director for Access Computing and Access Advance. And she's doing all kinds of interesting work that she's going to share with us. And that includes direct interventions for individuals with disabilities, as well as working with faculty, employers, and other community members to create institutional change, which I know is something that a bunch of you are also doing. So thank you so much, Brianna, for taking some of your valuable time to join us today. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me. And I'm so excited that we have a bunch of folks here to talk about this. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully it goes to slideshow view and you can see the presentation. Awesome. I'm really excited to talk about this. I think we don't talk often enough about disability data. We don't collect it enough. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my viewpoint. And I do come from the world of thinking about education and employment. I know many of you may be coming from different sectors where you're thinking slightly differently about what disability might mean. Um, so I work on a variety of programs, again, related to increasing the participation of people with disabilities in STEM education and careers. I mostly work with computer scientists. So that's, you'll hear me say computing and computer science a lot as I talk. So when we think about disability in our work, we consider the fact that we all have a variety of abilities and we are more or less able to do a variety of things based on our ability status, right? So everyone is more or less able to understand English or social norms, see or hear, walk, maybe read print or write with a pen or pencil, right? We could think about things like communicating verbally, tuning out distractions, learning. We could think about our physical and our mental health. So there's a variety of different things that come into defining whether somebody has a disability or not. And that can be hard to measure. So, the kind of the access issues we often see are folks saying they have a lack of mentors or there's stigma around disability and claiming a disability, difficulty getting accommodations. And that comes into play as we think about data in the education and employment space. Part of this is that it's quite costly sometimes to get proper documentation such that an institution or organization will grant you accommodation. Things like inaccessible websites, tools, software, uncaptioned videos that folks can't hear. So these are some of the kinds of things that we are thinking about in our work. So why are we talking about data? I came into this space after working in issues related to women and girls in STEM. And as soon as I started working in disability, I was like, well, great, I don't know anything about disability. Like, I'm going to sit down and read the literature base. I'm going to look for the data that's out there. What do we know? And frankly, there's just so little, right? Not many people are publishing about the participation of people with disabilities in STEM. I mean, I could name most of the people that are doing that in the US because it's so gets so little attention compared to particularly race and gender in this space. And that really bugged me. Why aren't we talking about this? Why are we collecting data often on race and gender and then not just adding disability to see what we can learn about the population? The other thing that we think a lot about in our space is that accessibility is often an afterthought or it's treated as an issue of compliance. So as we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, oftentimes folks aren't thinking about accessibility in that space because that's a compliance issue. Our Student Disability Services Office will worry about that. That's not our job. And so again, trying to bring this more fully into our conversations about DEIA, and we put the A on there, of course, at the end. But more than that, my colleague, Richard Ladner here at UW noticed that over time, the data changed significantly if you look at the survey of earned doctorates, and I'll talk more about that as we go. So I'm mostly talking about a paper we published in 2020. We gave the presentation just as things were shutting down here in the Pacific Northwest. Looking at specifically, why is data on disability so hard to collect and understand in the context of broadening participation in computing? So there are some exceptions out there, and I think it's really important to note this. This is comes out of the Computing Research Association, who collects data from computing departments from across the country. And they asked folks, do you feel like an outsider in computing? And what I think is particularly interesting here is that the top two categories are women with disabilities and the URM, which stands for underrepresented minorities with disabilities, right? Below that, we have women and underrepresented minority women, and then all students with disabilities, right? So clearly this impacts our students' education and careers, and we're just not talking about it, right? But when we talk about it, we can see these things and maybe start to talk about them and address them more fully. So again, part of what we're interested in is why aren't we as a community collecting this, and how can we start a conversation about collecting this data within our community and offer folks best practices about how they might collect the data. So over the years, we had tried to get partners that we work with to get institutional data from their universities about how many students with disabilities are in your department. Specifically, getting institutional data at UW, we can get two different data points from the university. One is whether somebody gets disability services from the Disability Services Office. And again, we know that is necessarily going to be an undercount because you have to have access to documentation to get those services. I know many students with disabilities who don't request services, right? So they wouldn't come up. Sometimes they just don't feel like they need them. Other times, again, it is that documentation issue, which is definitely a class issue as well. The other data point we can get from UW is whether somebody marked it on their application when they applied to the university. And again, you can think of all kinds of reasons folks don't mark that, right, related to stigma and whatnot. So when we asked folks, why aren't you asking, or why can't you get this data from us? Or when we heard anecdotally from folks over time, some people said, well, we focus on women or underrepresented minorities in computing, so we just don't ask for other demographic data, right? Oh, asking about disability is more sensitive than asking about race or gender. If we ask it, nobody's going to give us the accurate information. It's so confidential, so we don't ask it. It's unreliable because people don't want to disclose. It wasn't in our IRB application, so we just can't ask about it. I mean, these excuses go on. And part of it in writing this paper, listing them all out, was me kind of wanting to call people on, like, stop making excuses, right? Some people said, oh, our IRB just won't let us ask. Others said, we don't know who to ask. Do we ask the school? Do we ask the teacher? Do we ask the individual? We don't know what to ask. How can we phrase this question, or what data? Other folks said our institution doesn't systematically collect data. There's no disability data. Some institutions, again, it's been a while since, it's probably about 10 years ago we were doing this, said, oh, our disability services office is not in any way connected to our institutional data, or our institutional data isn't accurate. Institutions won't give us the data when we're asking for institutional data. These are the kinds of things we were hearing. I've also had people say it's illegal to ask. And it's no more illegal to ask about disability status than it is to ask folks about any other aspect of their identity. Okay, so we got a lot of reasons people aren't asking. Most of them we would still urge people to ask. But beyond that, even if we're asking, if we're trying to ask the question, how we ask it is important. And so here's a data from the survey of earned doctorates. So everybody in the US who completes a PhD completes the survey when they graduate, right? And so you can see between 2004 and 2009, it's between 1% to 2% of doctoral graduates have a disability. It jumps up in 2010 and 2011, it's around 3%. And then we see it jumps up over 7% after that. And so we could say, like, hey, maybe we're doing a really great job here. Look at this great increase of doctoral graduates with disabilities in just such a short time. Wow, we're really ahead of our game. Well, they just changed how they asked the question. So if we're not asking the question consistently over time, we're going to get different results. So from 2004 to 2009, the language they used asks, are you a person with a disability? Which of the following categories describes your disabilities, right? And so that's when we were getting around the 1% to 2%. They changed it in 2010, and they stopped asking that yes or no question first, right? They started just saying, well, do you have the following disabilities, and listing them out: blind or visually impaired, deaf or hard of hearing, physical or orthopedic disability, learning or cognitive disability, vocal or speech disability, or other. Okay, so we saw a bump when they started asking that question. And then the question changed dramatically in 2012. And it started asking about functional limitations. And this is very similar to language that you'll see in a lot of government surveys. Digging into it, it comes out of some UN recommendations about how to ask about disability. And so it asks about the usual degree of difficulty you have with seeing words or letters. And it does note with glasses or contacts, hearing, walking, lifting, concentrating, remembering, or making decisions. And it asks a couple other questions about, no, I don't have any, or what's the earliest age at when you first began experiencing any difficulties in any of these areas. And so the thing that's particularly interesting to note, if we look specifically at the data for folks who say that they are blind or low vision, in the survey of earned doctorates in 2017, 3.1% of participants claimed that they were blind or low vision. Now, if you compare that to the NCES data, it's like 0.1% of folks ages 3 to 21 are blind or low vision. there's just something there that doesn't jive, right? Somehow folks are getting marked as having a disability when they're being asked these questions about functional limitations in a way that doesn't match what the blind community knows about their relative prominence in the population. So again, and this is thinking about this from our context and thinking about education and employment, what are some of the issues with these functional limitation questions and what's going on here? One thing is, part of the question is, what's the threshold for having a disability, right? I have moderate difficulty doing something, severe difficulty, unable to do, and how do we decide where to draw that line? The other issue, it's unclear whether the participants understand these questions, right? That blind or low vision question, I have to assume that a lot of folks who use glasses or contacts are marking it as having difficulty with seeing. And then beyond that, a lot of these question sets are going to systematically exclude certain disabilities. Somebody who's autistic or has ADHD, anxiety, learning disabilities may or may not get caught by any of those questions. A lot of the arguments about using these questions is that they will catch people that might not otherwise be marked as having a disability. I often, when I think about that, I reflect on my mother, who's in her 70s. She has rheumatoid arthritis. She's had 5 joint replacements now. And if you asked her if she had a disability, she can't walk very far. If you asked her if she had a disability, she'd be like, well, no, I don't, despite having disability parking placard and all of these issues. But these questions, she would mark, yes, I have difficulty walking, right? And so I just throw that out there in terms of thinking about these questions might catch some people, but they are, we believe, unnecessarily catching some people, leaving other folks out. And so what could we be asking about disability, or where could we get data? Part of what I think it's important to note, again, is that these conversations in education and employment, or conversations about disability and accommodations, are intertwined, right? We know that accommodations require documentation, people don't disclose. So we know that our institutional data is not necessarily accurate as well. So what kind of data does exist out there? And again, my apologies, this is US centric, since that's the context I am normally working in. Students with disabilities in K-12 education either receive services under IDEA through an individualized education plan or a 504 plan. And the distinctions aren't necessarily important for our purposes here, but what I think is particularly interesting to note is if you look at the data, and again, this is coded in institutional data in K-12 systems, the percentage of students with disabilities is going to vary by state, right? So Texas, 9.2% of the students in K-12 education have a disability. In Pennsylvania, it's 18.6. Now, is that because there's a really big difference in the prevalence of disability between states? Probably not. It probably has a lot to do with who is getting diagnosed, parents advocating for their students, the mindset of the institutions regarding evaluating students for disabilities, a variety of things like that. In post-secondary education, again, students, if we're looking at and thinking about institutional data, they have to request accommodations and document a disability. We know students don't disclose. I talked a little bit about this already, so I'm not going to belabor the point. Again, we have found a lot of times you can get information from the Office of Institutional Research, but I will talk about some problems with this data later on. We've developments since we first wrote this paper in that area. And then the other setting we think a little bit about is employment, right? So again, an employer is going to know who's requested accommodations and has documented a disability. If you look at national data sets, about 8 to 10% of the workforce reports a disability. And what we compare this to, back in the late teens, early 2020, a lot of tech companies were putting out these diversity reports every year. And so every year I'd see, oh, Microsoft released theirs, or LinkedIn, and I would open them up to see, oh, did they have disability data in here? If they did, what did it look like? And really it was quite telling, depending on whether they were just looking at who got accommodations versus asking about disability via a survey. You could see it was either that 1 to 2% if they were using their institutional data, somewhere around 6 to 7% if they were actually asking their workforce if they had a disability, right? So what we're asking and how we're getting at it is going to tell us different things. So some of the things we are advocating for as best practices in our community are to collect data on disability when you ask about any demographic information, right? If you're asking about race or gender, ask about disability. The other thing is then to actually analyze that data that you collect. So there's some pretty interesting meta-analysis out there about how often folks collect data on disability and then do nothing with it, which begs a lot of questions about why are we collecting this data. And then again, thinking about that example from the survey of earned doctorates, using consistent measures as a community to identify who has a disability that impacts their education and employment. Because as we change those measures and think differently about the question, we are really seeing different numbers. So the recommendations we've made in K-12 schooling is to look at students who qualify for an IEP or a 504 plan. You can get this data from schools. Teachers will know who the students in their classrooms are that have disabilities, and the students themselves most often know. I smile though, because I have a first grader, and I can't imagine that the first graders are like really tuned into whether they have a 504 plan or an IEP, but they also don't read a whole lot. So anyway, I'm amusing myself with that thought. It's a little more complicated when we talk about adults. What we have been suggesting folks ask if they are doing surveys is asking folks if they identify as having a disability or other chronic condition, and how you would describe your disability or chronic condition. What's really interesting to me is that as soon as we said, here's some questions and published a paper, people started taking it up like, oh, well, okay, now I can do this. Sometimes it's like we've given them permission or given them access to the information they didn't have. So then they could just start asking the question. So we've seen significant uptake from our community and asking about this even on like a conference evaluation form or other research that they are doing. I've worked a lot with the Computer Science Teachers Association and literally just giving them questions. They were like, okay, well, we'll ask this every time we ask about any data, and then we can actually look at how disability is impacting our organization. And I mean, that's a really simple exercise, right? How can we just take what we're already thinking about demographic and identity information and include disability? So again, we wrote this paper in 2020, and we did call out specific members of our organization that were not collecting data on disability. And so a few things, happy things to report, and some progress we've made in this space in the last few years. There's a report put out every year by code.org, who's one of the major providers of computer science curriculum in the K-12 schools. It did not include disability. As of I think it was 2021, they started including disability data, and it comes from state data sets. And some states, they are able to actually get information about which students are enrolling in computer science classes in high school, middle school, and elementary school. And it's unclear what to make of the data yet. In some areas, 504 or IDEA students are actually overrepresented. And so it's interesting. I don't know what to make of it yet, but again, we've at least started having that data. I mentioned on the bottom the CSTA landscape survey of computer science teachers. We got them to start collecting information about disability, and there were two interesting things to me in there. One is they realized that 10% of computer science teachers in the country, these are K-12 computer science teachers, had a disability. And so realizing that the conversations they wanted to have in the context of professional development for those teachers didn't just need to be about teaching students with disabilities, but also thinking about the disabilities in the teacher community and how to make their own offerings more accessible. They also had some interesting data. They were asking about teaching about different culturally relevant topics. So we asked, computer science teachers, do you teach about accessibility and disability in terms of technology? And about 20% of K-12 computer science teachers said, yeah, they're teaching something about that, which is actually very comparable to what we see at the post-secondary level. And I would have expected it to be much lower. Now on the top on the right is a screenshot of the Talby survey, which is a survey put out by the Computing Research Association that has data from computer science departments from across the country. And so after our paper came out, we had a number of conversations with them about how they could start collecting disability data. They did a feasibility study of the departments that they survey of, just can you get institutional data about your students, right? This is not a survey of individual people. It is a survey of the departments and their institutional data. And we're really glad after the feasibility study, a number of departments said, yeah, we can get this data, that's no problem. And so for the past 2 years, they have reported on disability data. And yet, it's not been great. Something like 40% of the departments reported that 0 undergraduates in their department received accommodations, which again, just doesn't pass the sniff test based on how prevalent we know disability is in the undergraduate population. So I am looking forward to hopefully having some more conversations with them about how we can determine whether folks are getting accurate data or just putting zeros there when they can't otherwise get data. So I'm happy to move on to discussion. I will just mention I'm always happy to chat about this stuff. You're welcome to email me. My email is Blaser, BLASER @uw.edu. Also, in the work that we do, we are very interested in getting information about disability accessibility in STEM education and careers out to folks. If you are interested in joining an email-based community practice to get more of this information, you can email me or you can email DOIT, DOIT @uw.edu. So I'm gonna stop talking there.
Thank you so much. It was extremely helpful in both giving us a grounding and what does the history of asking questions about disability look like. Those examples were extremely helpful. I know a number of people in the chat have mentioned how helpful it was to see those questions. And I think you're right, simply the act of giving permission for people to try and think about why they wouldn't do it and encourage them to do it is incredibly important. So thank you so much. And we're going to turn it over now to the live Q&A part of today. So if you're in the room and you want to unmute and ask a question or make a comment, share an experience, go ahead and raise your hand. You can raise your hand. If you're using Zoom, it depends on the setup. But usually in the reactions section, which is like a smiley face with a plus on their head, you can raise your hand and then we'll unmute you. If you can't figure out how to raise your hand, you can just unmute yourself or put in the chat that you want to unmute yourself. We're happy to figure out how to make sure. And while we're waiting to see if anybody in the room wants to ask a question, we will also go to the chat where you can again ask questions to everyone or direct message me. One of the recent questions is, do you experience barriers with participants' literacy levels? I am currently trying to gather disability data with a community experiencing mental health and substance abuse, but I'm concerned their literacy will pose a barrier. Excellent question. What do you think?
I mean, that is a good question. I think I don't see that a lot in my work. Again, mostly I'm working with folks who are pursuing computer science degrees. And so they're in post-secondary education. And so we don't see that, but I mean, I can definitely imagine that it's a population I don't know a lot about, but definitely could be an issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question. And we'll also circle back and see because it's very likely that there are people who are working in the same area as you that might have resources. And if so, we'll post those on the forum with the recording of today. And one of the things that I know, we talked a little bit about this, just a tiny little bit about this last spring when we were talking about the Toronto Center for Addiction and Mental Health. They were collecting data from people who were experiencing homelessness, and they were talking about asking disability questions, and they were doing something much closer, Brianna, to the examples that you showed about, I think you called it functional, like where they don't use like diagnoses, but they ask specific kind of concrete questions that use words that the people that you're collecting data on will know, like, do you have trouble seeing? Do you have trouble carrying heavy things? And I know that you said there were pros and cons to those questions, but maybe one of the pros is that it is really easily understandable by people who, aren't going to know necessarily a word that isn't, isn't in their day to day.
I think too, like a lot of those questions, in those questions too, I think a lot about, I have an anxiety disorder and I think about folks with mental health conditions. And when that becomes a disability versus not a disability, I think is a really complicated question. And depending on, I was looking at those functional limitations questions today, and the one about concentration. Oh yeah, some days I'd be like, yeah, I have a hard time concentrating, and that's because of my anxiety. And yet, I know a lot of folks with anxiety who it's hard to mark that box and say, yeah, that's a disability for me, right? And so, sometimes I
Mhm.
think they miss a lot of folks. I do think some like autistic folks just wouldn't be caught by those questions.
Yeah. Can you might not be able to answer this question, but I think on that topic where you're talking about, self-identification, and then I think at some point you said for certain situations, in order to qualify for exemptions, you need to have some kind of official documentation. Can you tell me a little bit more about like where that line is?
Yeah, so if you look at the recommendations coming out of the Association for Higher Education and Disability, and this is the U.S. National Association of Folks that work in disability services, they're traditionally they required really strict documentation of any disability. So even if you walked in and said, I'm a wheelchair user and were in a wheelchair, or said I'm blind and you had a cane, they'd be like, well, great, I need some documentation from your provider. Which, if we're talking about something like ADHD or autism, may be reasonable, but for somebody where it's an apparent disability, it was always a little bit laughable. Like,
Mhm.
I can't see, I
Mhm.
have a cane and a guide dog. Like, what? Um, and that has relaxed in the last few years, um, with the exception largely of invisible disabilities. And the issues about getting documentation for autism, attention deficits, learning disorder, or learning disabilities, or mental health disabilities is that you have to get them diagnosed. Um, Oftentimes, it can be several months to a year wait to get into certain providers. It is also very expensive. So an autism or attention deficit screening could be a couple $1,000s. And if you look at data that looks at the socioeconomic status of students that are getting accommodations, students from higher income backgrounds who have parents who can afford that without insurance or without doing it through the school system are more likely to get those accommodations. Again, which says something about all of the problems in the way that we think about disability and identify it in the education setting. In K-12 settings in the US, schools will do those evaluations themselves if they think it's appropriate. In the post-secondary setting, you are responsible and employment responsible for that yourself. And so we often work with high school students and are like, make sure you have accurate, up-to-date documentation in high school so that when you get to college, that documentation is still good. Because if they say, well, you haven't been evaluated since you were in second grade, you no longer have autism, which that's not really a thing. But again,
Mhm.
schools can be really strict on what they consider proper documentation and not. We see this come out a
Mhm.
lot with emotional support animals. There's like all these places online that'll say, oh, we'll write you a letter for a couple $100s. Well, you don't really have a therapeutic relationship with somebody you've met with once online. And so that documentation may not be accepted by an institution. Now, the institutions get really frustrated by these kind of letter mills, but I often think the student is in a setting where they don't know that that's not going to be legitimate documentation. And they just really are trying to get their needs met.
Yeah. And there's so many competing priorities for incentives, right? Um, yeah, wow. Very, very complicated. Thank you for helping me understand kind of where the official line is, and makes a lot of sense. Like the guide dog, or not the guide dog, but this emotional support animal, you know, the more barriers we put up to getting officially certified, we might think, well, the more likely we are to conserve resources for the people who really need them. And at the same time, we're making it harder for people who aren't in positions of privilege and power to jump all through those barriers. Very hard. Um, okay, couple of questions in the chat. Oh, Sam has hand raised. Hey, Sam.
Hello, my name's Sam Hawkins, they, them. I am off camera. Yeah, I just had a few thoughts about the documentation piece I wanted to throw out from my experience and some of the experiences of people I know. It is really hard. Like, it is such an administrative burden to get the documentation, especially a lot of chronic conditions. You can be disabled by them for a long time before you get diagnosed, especially women and people of color tend to have a higher barrier to getting diagnosed because of a lot of misogyny and racism in healthcare. And yeah, it's interesting how the people who identify as disabled and people who be considered disabled by different medical standards do and don't overlap. Myself and quite a few people I know identify as disabled, are multiply disabled, but work from home meets a lot of our access needs. So we would probably be needing accommodations if we were in the office, and we're not because being able to work from home does it for us. Similarly, in the educational setting, my brother had single-sided deafness. He never had a 504 because his teachers were always just cool about letting him sit on the right side of the classroom. Like that wasn't a big deal, but some teachers would make that a big deal. And the other thing about requiring it, besides the barrier to getting it, is it can be really invasive. I remember when I was trying to get accommodations in grad school, they were asking a lot of really invasive questions on like the stock form for mental health conditions about, what medications have you tried? How compliant are you with them? They don't need to know that to give me extra time on the test. And then also, and serious discrimination. I know I recently found out my workplace, they like ask to just have an ROI with your doctor to just talk to them without you there. Wild, would not do that. That's so invasive. So a lot of people don't want to like that. I think there's a lot of issues with asking for this level of documentation for accommodations, and it's the reason a lot of people don't do it.
Oh, totally. I worked with a faculty member who was trying to remain working from home because they are at a high risk for COVID complications. And they got a form from their university that was asking them about their toileting habits and their intellectual capacity. And it was like, whoa, this is not what we're talking about at all. And he was like, do I have to tell them this? He's also a wheelchair user. I don't know what his toileting habits are. I don't know any of that, but he was like, I don't want to tell them this. And I was like, don't tell them. Just tell them what they need to know. And part of that, somebody uh, put something in the chat too, is that our universities have to look at how they're treating folks and asking these questions, and it affects faculty as much as students. This work happened to be focused on students, but it definitely affects faculty too.
The other thing is doctors are taught to treat chronic conditions. A lot of doctors don't understand accommodations. So there really is this dynamic where doctors are seen as the authority on your body and your needs. When, I mean, sometimes, I know occupational therapists might be more appropriate, and also just talk to the person. A lot of doctors don't know what accommodations are available. They don't know how to accommodate disabilities. That's not their level of expertise. They know how to treat your rheumatoid arthritis with, drugs. They really don't know, what accommodations you might need in the classroom.
Totally.
That is such a good point. I really like how you framed it, Sam, about who has the power, right? Data equity is all about who has the power, who gets to decide. And it's so true that this system is setting up some sort of an external point of power. Yeah. Yeah. We need doctor's notes, but doctors don't know. That's a really good way to put it.
I think too, it's something I see, and Sam brought this up as well, is particularly when I'm dealing with college students who might just be getting a diagnosis and it can be unclear for a long time what is actually going on. Um, and of course, there's equity issues involved with who is likely to be diagnosed, as Sam points out too.
There's a couple of other questions in the chat. My work typically deals with smaller population levels. Yes, actually, this was a note that I wrote down while you were talking as well about small populations, where I could imagine that the second part of your recommended question set may yield some pretty low and identifiable ends, which is like, if you have two people, it's easy to, that's what the identifiable ends phrase means. I want to make sure that data collected are used and analyzed appropriately, but also are not exposing or identifying individuals. What recommendations do you have about asking about that, analyzing, and reporting? I'm going to let you answer that. And then I'm also going to put a link in the chat to a Talking Data Equity where we talk about small populations. Some of the suggestions will be good, some of them will not.
I mean, I do think that could be a place where you decide not to ask that second question. Even in working with fairly large N groups, those Ns are very small of who's, has which kind of disability. I'm trying to think, in most settings, I know that has not been useful yet. We use it in our work where we have, a group of hundreds of people with disabilities, just to have a sense of how the disability types are distributed across the group we're working with. But yeah, I think that's a place where you may decide to just drop that second question. I've also seen folks combine the two questions so that they are giving those examples of disability, so that somebody doesn't just see the first question of, do you have a disability, yes or no, and kind of get freaked out and not answer it. So again, there are different ways you could approach it, but I think definitely you would want to be really careful about things being too identifiable for folks with small N's, and I would probably skip that second question unless I had an explicit reason I wanted that information. When we're talking about larger N's, it may be useful to know, like, hey, all the students with mobility impairment said there's a problem at our university. Could we address that through better sidewalks, less stairs on our, whatever. But yeah, a lot of settings where you probably won't get enough data for that to be useful.
Yeah. And sometimes you can collect data for internal use only, where only one or two people who can actually use that information to make decisions and deploy resources, but the data never gets published outside of those one or two people, is also sometimes worth doing. If you need to, build something, change infrastructure, you might need to know what you're going to do, but you would never want to make that public.
I see a couple of questions in the chat about whether this should be a binary variable of whether you have a disability or not. And I think that is something that is so complicated about this question. It's given me a lot of pause over the years as I talk to folks, who are like, well, I don't know if I have a disability or not. And oftentimes I've responded with, well, do you think, whatever this is, some folks have asked me that have had speech-related disabilities. And I've said, well, do you think it's affected your education and employment? If so, yeah. And then I reflect on something a colleague of mine said once of like, the disability community is not trying to keep people out. Like, we want to bring people in. It's okay to claim you have a disability. And so I have reflected on that, again, thinking about my own identity and folks I work with, if you're willing to claim the identity, folks are happy to have you. And I think there's a lot of stigma built in claiming that identity or putting it onto other people. And so I think that is really complicated, but I don't have this, and I guess the functional limitation questions do get at not making this a binary. But then again, when does something become a disability versus not when you're looking at those questions? And I don't know how to use them otherwise. When I don't have a conceptualization of disability as something that is either present or not. I don't think there's easy answers. I guess what I'm saying.
Exactly. As I said, when we were getting ready, no one in this group will trust an easy answer anyways. Leslie, hi, go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much for this important topic. I am lots of thoughts going through my head, but I guess the question that I'll choose to ask is, have you seen, especially working in education since the SCOTUS affirmative action ruling came out, increased hesitancy to even want to ask questions about disability? I know people are really concerned about how it's interpreted, and my simple mind, I'm thinking spilling over into other demographic categories. I'd be interested to hear. And Heather, I don't know, that might be a topic consideration, like what's happening with the SCOTUS affirmative action and what we're doing with data collection, demographic data collection. So, yeah, really interested. Thank you.
Yeah, I haven't had that many conversations specifically about SCOTUS yet, but what I've had a ton of conversations about this year, when I've been in spaces with DEI folks is some of the laws that are coming out in Florida and Texas that are removing DEI type organizations from their universities and outlawing them. And questions about how do we continue to do this work given this climate. And something that was really interesting to me, I see that and I'm very concerned for the work I do. And I was talking to a woman who's teaches at HBCU in Florida, and she was like, oh, honey, you don't need to worry. You're not even on the radar of the folks that are trying to outlaw this stuff, right? Disability is just not on their radar. And I think that is a place where it's this compliance issue versus this DEI issue. And maybe in those settings, maybe it's okay to be like, yes, this is just compliance, right? This is an equity, which is not at all how I really think about it. But her thought was like, you're not on anybody's radar, so you're safe. You know, it's those of us who are thinking about race and gender that are on the chopping block.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And I think too, there's so much still stigma and bullying and violence that happens with people with disabilities. But it's, again, that also flies under the radar. So it's kind of like that, the dog whistle kind of thing, right? You know, it's not really, we don't hear about it, but it's happening. But yeah, thank you for doing this important work.
Thank you so much, Leslie. And a couple of other folks have amplified the request to have a talking data equity on the SCOTUS decisions and all of the various fallouts. So I will actively get on to that, and I'm gonna ask you folks for a little bit of help on that one, because I would love to know who knows somebody, or even if you don't know them personally, do you want to suggest somebody you wish that we could get? So I'm putting into the chat a type form, and that type form is always available. I didn't just make it. And you can suggest a guest. You don't have to know the guest. If you do, that's great, but you don't have to. And it's anonymous. We're not going to ask you who you are. And you can also always suggest a topic. And so I'll put both of these in the chat. We're right now booking folks for winter. And so we would love to hear who you would love to hear from. So please tell us who you would like to see or who could talk to this SCOTUS decision, and we will see who we can get on. There's a really important question in the chat to follow up on the idea about unreported violence connected to unreported disabilities. And the question is, have you seen any successful practices or interventions or programs that helped reduce the stigma around reporting disabilities? And one of the questions specifically wants to know if you've seen any success in the stigma around mental health disorders for people of color.
Yeah, you know, I'm thinking of I work often with an organization called WEPAN. I'm trying to think of what it stands for, Women in Engineering Proactive Network. And when they started asking a question about disability, they took the language we had suggested and added something about environments being disabling, right? This idea that it's not you that's disabled, the environment is disabling you, which is more closely in line with the social model of disability rather than this medical model focusing on disabilities. And so I really liked that language, and it made me think about how we talk about that. The idea, the question of I think that's probably all I can say on the question, though, in terms of thinking more about stigma and race. We do work with a lot of organizations that work with Black or Latinx students and try and connect with their students with disabilities and try and do it in a mindful way. But it's not where my expertise is.
Great. Thank you so much. And we have time for only, I think, one more question. And there's a few people who have asked it, and you've just referred to it. So can you give us a little introduction or reminder on what the difference is between the medical model and the social model of disability? Like, those terms have been used a few times today by a couple of different people. What does that mean?
Yeah, gosh, this is something I'm not as good at doing off the top of my head when I'm not thinking on that topic. But the medical model looks at, like, the problem is within your body. We need to fix the problem, and instead of looking at the environment, right? The social model is about how are we being disabled by the environment? How could the environment improve? So if we think about things like, well, the problem is that the video isn't captioned. It's not the problem that I can't hear the video. It's the problem that it wasn't designed to be used by a wide range of people. And so the problem's not with the people. We're not trying to fix the people. It is about how do we make this environment more welcoming and usable.
That makes perfect sense. Thank you so much for offering us that definition off the top of your head. I really, really appreciate it. And I think in order to respect everyone's time, we're going to wrap it up there so that if you happen to have back-to-back meetings or this is your lunch break, you aren't stuck signing off right at the top of the hour. So before you leave, I want to emphasize that we don't have Talking Data Equity next Friday. We're taking next Friday off. And so we're back in 2 weeks, which is Friday, September 8th. And we're going to be joined by Dr. Lauren Young and some of their team members from Beloved. And Beloved is an organization that does evaluation with a strong racial equity lens. So they are going to bring some really practical projects to talk about. I know, I'm sorry. I apologize that there's no Talking Data Equity next Friday. But we'll see you in 2 weeks. Okay, so with the housekeeping out of the way, I really want to say thank you so much to Brianna and bringing your expertise on such a critical and often overlooked and forgotten topic. We don't take for granted that you were willing to spend an hour with us today. It really meant a lot. We learned a ton. We will share the recording. We will share all the resources in the forum. And everybody take really good care of yourselves and take really good care of each other. And I hope that you'll come back soon. And a huge thank you to the community and specifically Dr. Blaser. Bye, everybody.